Welcome, everyone. Thank you to all our panelists and to everyone who is joining us. My name is Hector Hoyos. I'm an associate professor of Iberian and Latin American cultures, director of Iberian and Latin American cultures as well, and modern thought and literature. It is my pleasure, my privilege, and an honor to introduce a distinguished panel today. I think that this might very well be the last of the great Zoom events. We are, fingers crossed, at the tail end of a pandemic. And next time that we resume the conversation, it's going to be in person. I'm going to speak for just a few minutes to get things going and to introduce our distinguished panelists. I'd first like to thank Stanford Global Studies, SGS, and its director, Professor Jishan Menon, for supporting this initiative, as well as the research group Materia, along with Romina Weinberg and Jimena Briceño, the program in modern thought and literature, and Joe Wager and Crystal. Again, thank you so very much for organizing us. This wouldn't be possible without the support of many people also at the Division of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages. We have 4 speakers with us today, and this is the first event of a mini series, a 2-day series, where we are tackling the question of law and humanities. Again, a big question that several of our panelists have written a great deal about. This time with an important twist, and that would be approaching it from the global south, a problem of a term, of course, and a concept that we also want to problematize. We don't want to take it for granted as a point of departure, but rather use it as an excuse to have a broad-ranging conversation. If one thinks of important landmark publications in the field, Professor Bernadette Meiler, who is watching us and will be joining us tomorrow at some point, and Liz Anker's important reader on law and literature, or the Oxford Companion. One thing that stands out is that there are few contributions from the Global South, and that, for instance, in the case of Latin America is an object of study, but not a subject of enunciation when it comes to thinking about law and humanities. And that, truly stands out. So as law and humanities reaches new frontiers, it also has a bit of a debt, I think, to be honest, with all of these other locales of enunciation. And so we want to make headway into this problem and produce new knowledge, because that doesn't emerge if it isn't in conversation. There are real obstacles for this kind of inter-institutional, locale conversation. And for once, Zoom is an affordance that will help us to make progress here. I'd like to introduce our panelists one after the other, and also the dynamic of our gathering. Esther Guzmán Rodríguez has a JSD from Stanford Law School. She is currently a profesora asociada, an associate professor at Universidad Nacional de Colombia in Bogotá, and she is the deputy director of De Justicia, a really important research center in Colombia. I'm going to, by the way, keep introductions very brief. You all have accomplished a great deal, but I want us to get at the conversations. Professor Leila Neti in English in Occidental College has published a really wonderful book called Colonial Law in India and the Victorian Imagination. I think she has addressed squarely the question of law and humanities from the Global South. She has written on contemporary Anglophone literature, post-colonial theory, Victorian literature, and it just came to my attention that one of the graduate students in Iberian and Latin American cultures, Tania Flores, was your student at Oxy some years ago. So she says hello, and I pass on her hellos. Beth Piatote is an associate professor in the departments of comparative literature and Native American studies at our neighbor institution, UC Berkeley, and I am beyond overjoyed to say that she is also a modern thought and literature alumna from Stanford University. She is a scholar of Native American, Indigenous literature and law, a creative writer, also of fiction, poetry, plays, and essays, an Indigenous language revitalization activist and healer. She is the author of 2 books, Domestic Subjects, Gender, Citizenship, and Law in Native American Literature, which won an MLA award, and The Beadworkers' Stories with Counterpoint in 2019, which has been short and long listed for a number of important literary awards. She is also serving in the International Council of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. As I introduce you, I also point out that when we think of Global South, we're being quite capacious because none of the territories that Professor Piatote works on is south of the equator, if that's how we're going to visualize the Global South, right? That's, I guess, already part of the conversation. Meanwhile, Professor Marco Wan is a professor of law at the University of Hong Kong, where he also directs the Law and Literature Studies program, and who has very influentially been the managing editor of Law and Literature, a flagship in the field. His first book, Masculinity and the Trials of Modern Fiction, is an examination of literary trials in 19th century England and France. If you haven't read the chapter on Oscar Wilde, it's amazing. It's really, the best piece of writing that I know of on, such a challenging and important topic. His second book, Film and Constitutional Controversy, through Cambridge in 2021, explores constitutional debates in Hong Kong cinema. That is the object of study there. Very well. We are amongst esteemed colleagues, and what I have asked everyone to think about in preparation for our event is a few questions to get the conversation started. We're going to have rounds of answer and interrupt each other when the spirit should move anyone to interject. And I'll have maybe Diana, if you would, start us out with the problem of the Global South. Is it operative in your thinking? Are there alternatives to consider? Diana, please take it away.
Thank you, Hector, for your question. And I would like to start by thanking all the people in charge of organizing this event, which I find really fascinating and really thought-provoking, but also very challenging, in part because for the past few years, I haven't been working on these issues or reflecting on the relationship between law and literature. I've been more immersed in the real life of a human rights lawyer in a Global South country. And with this, I answered your question. Yes, the idea of Global South has been very present in my practice for the past years. And I would like to confess that some years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, I wouldn't have imagined that I myself using this concept as often as I do nowadays. So why do I use it? Despite the fact that I acknowledge that it has a lot of conceptual problems, that it's somehow difficult to understand the array of meaning that it conveys. So I would say that I'm going to start by presenting this very briefly. Sorry. Do you see my presentation here? This is a map, which brings the first idea that comes to the mind of people when we think about Global South, the difference between the rich North and the poor South, which in a way brings an idea of a geographic location. But rather than this, I would like to think, or I like to think of Global South as something different. This is not as an ontological entity, but rather as a more epistemological construct in which we can see basically different relationships, power relationships that are actually affecting the ways in which countries, populations, and nations relate to each other. So how do I understand Global South and why is it useful for me in my practice? basically for three reasons. First of all, because it approaches global difference from a perspective that focuses on power relations rather than on development or cultural difference. And I think that's very important because by emphasizing power relations, it brings attention to issues such as coloniality, neo-imperialism, and other forms of injustice. And in doing so, it also allows us to actually think of the consequences of those injustices in daily lives, in people's daily lives. And that's important in my practice as a human rights lawyer, of course. Additionally, unlike notions such as third world or as this basic idea or this basic difference between civilized and uncivilized societies, I think Global South seems to describe or convey a non-linear idea about development or about the differences between groups. This brings me to the second idea that I think is important within the concept of Global South I tend to use in my work, which is the idea of contingency. Even though it focuses on power relations, it doesn't give the idea that those power relations are constant or unhistorical. On the contrary, it brings the idea that they can change. And in the sense that they can change, it gives us a possibility to include some ideas about transformation of those injustices that it conveys. And in this idea of transformation, there are some other ideas that are important to me within this concept. First of all, the matter of positionality. It's not about location, but it is about the position of people within a power structure. From this perspective, we can talk about the perspective of the subaltern, and it brings also the possibility of understand different or to include different sensitivities towards aspects that the global north experience usually obscures. So it brings light towards new forms of injustice and power inequalities. And also by bringing the perspective of the subaltern to the center of the debate, it creates an opportunity to understand the Global South as a site of knowledge production, not only as a site that is studied or there is actually analyzed by others or by Global North authors, but also as a site of knowledge production, which I think is very important because it brings a very important sense of how vibrant the Latin American and the Asian and the African academic communities are, and how the relationships between Global North and Global South academy also affect the ways in which we understand knowledge production. And finally, the third idea, why I consider or why I still use the concept of Global South is that it actually somehow allows us to understand or to see that there are important connections between countries with colonial pasts that are different, yes, of course, but somehow create common challenges and common concerns that we should approach. And it creates also an opportunity for dialogue and solidarity. And this idea of dialogue and solidarity are very important in the practice of Global South, because usually when you think of the problems of Latin America and you only focus on Latin America or the problems of Colombia, it's very hard to see the connections that they can have with, for example, what has happened in Africa, in Asia, and in different countries. And the point is, even though we have different problems and even though we have a different colonial path, we face similar challenges, and it's possible to have very productive dialogues, south to south dialogues that can create better bonds of solidarity, but also better approaches to our common problems. So I think this concept of Global South also brings more productive space for horizontal relationships rather than hierarchical relationships, which I think brings very interesting possibilities, both for knowledge production, but also for solidarity across nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for getting us started, and also for observing the 3 to 5 minute time limit. I appreciate that. And let me pass it over to Leila.
Thank you. I actually want to also begin by just taking a moment to thank Hector for arranging this wonderful opportunity for us to have this conversation, to Joe and Crystal and Romy for helping, and to all my co-panelists for joining in this conversation, and all of the audience to spend your evening with us tonight. So I'll begin by saying that I agree with everything that Diana said just now, except for I think my answer perhaps approaches the question from a slightly different perspective, which is less involved in everyday practice of law, and more sort of interested in the imaginative kind of scope of both the legal and literary fields. So I guess maybe I have a little bit more ambivalence about the term for some of these reasons. So of course, I appreciate the usefulness of the term Global South, especially for the purpose of capturing more some of the more diffuse and deterritorialized forms of power and influence. And I really appreciate Diana's emphasis on the role that power plays in the term itself, right? That it sort of centralizes that as a object of analysis. And I think that's exactly right. But within my own work, I focus primarily on how the British colonial past has produced the post-colonial present and future. This is a way of narrowing my parameters that does not at all contest the importance of the Global South methodology. However, there are specific legal histories that are a product of colonial rule that are really about territorial control, and that cannot always be easily mapped onto the broader framework of the Global South. Within colonial law in India, the primary interlocutors were the British police, judges, and lawyers on the one hand, and the colonized people on the other. Often these interactions involve specific histories of caste, religion, race, particular formulations of gender and sexuality, and so on. For example, the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 identified the practice of thuggee as a form of hereditary criminality within Indian society. The act derived its authority from what colonial administrator W.H. Sleeman identified as the cult of thuggee. According to Sleeman, and this was, the recent historians have suggested that Sleeman largely invented this concept. But according to Sleeman, thugs were ritual stranglers who preyed upon travelers, killing them and stealing their jewels and money in the service of the goddess Kali. This paradigmatic example of hereditary criminality became a blueprint, I argue, for thinking about Indian criminality and about Indian colonial subjectivity more broadly. Colonial fears of the thug came to influence quotidian interactions between the English and their Indian subjects, and also provided a backdrop for thinking about English criminality in contrast to the specter of its colonial counterpart. Today in the United States, the figure of the thug continues to symbolize racialized criminality, so there is a kind of horizontal movement across time and space. Within India in the 19th century, however, the relationship between the thug and the state was largely vertical, and that verticality continues to structure contemporary post-colonial life in India and in the Global South, including in Black and Brown communities in the United States. The vision of the horizontal community across the Global South, I think, is useful in this respect for thinking through the broader structural relationships between nations and populations, while colonial and post-colonial perhaps captures the more vertical forms of power. So I see the two terms having different and equally important uses. To the extent that the notion of a Global South comes out of the Bandung movement and non-alignment, it is also a concept that is oriented toward a history beyond the colonial moment. because my work focuses primarily on how colonial law has impacted contemporary imaginative possibilities, the horizontal model of the global South is not necessarily the main focus of my analysis, but I'm always, of course, interested in comparative histories and points of intersection.
Thank you very much, Leila. And I'll pass the mic over to Beth.
I also want to say thank you, Yao, to Hector and Joe and Crystal and Romy and everyone who's joined us here tonight, and especially to my fellow panelists. It's such an honor to be here with you. So I would say that the most obvious connection of my work is through the articulation with global Indigenous studies, a concept that's now become the dominant paradigm in my field over the past 15 years. So many programs in Native American studies have expanded to become Native American and Indigenous studies, or simply Indigenous studies. And prior to the expansion of the idea of global Indigenous studies, the most common North-South articulation was hemispheric Native studies, which found its footing in the Colombian quincentennial of 1992. So my first conceptualizations of a transnational Indigenous studies was through this hemispheric concept, which is clearly a North-South paradigm of the Americas and is clearly still a dominant sort of framework within global Indigenous studies. So global Indigenous studies as a framework disrupts the binary of the global South and the global North, because while it contains a component of the global South, it also brings visibility to conditions in the Arctic and North Europe, to New Zealand and Australia, and to create different kinds of networks of articulation. So in the same way that South and North are not actual geographic frameworks, indigeneity as a category upends certain configurations of what is North and South. The concept of indigeneity as a category is one that scholars are regularly grappling with. What are the meaningful characteristics of this category? What do Indigenous people share beyond the experience of colonization? And here I do want to acknowledge what Deanna has said about how important it is to understand colonization and power and shared experiences with inequality and oppression and colonization. And, you know, we recognize that colonization has played out differently, but to always be comparing colonial context and the experience of colonization is something that reinforces the power of colonialism and constructs Indigenous people as always in relationship to this external force. So comparative law and literature, or more broadly, law and the humanities, is an approach that can help draw out the diversity and specificity of Indigenous experience, as well as these common themes, especially related again to colonial power. But it's especially important that law and literature approaches bring visibility to Indigenous concepts and practices of law, of Indigenous law, because it gives us an opportunity to think about competing legal systems. So novels, songs, films, and performances and other cultural texts are sites where we can examine the construction and the collision of. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much. I am jotting down notes as I turn on and off the microphone, and sometimes it's information overload. Oh, so much to talk about. I'll pass it over to Marco, please.
I also want to begin by thanking the organizers of this roundtable and thanking everyone for joining us here this evening. So I have to confess, I mean, I haven't written on any jurisdiction or region that's usually defined as the global South. But as I was thinking about the theme of the roundtable, I think the idea of the global South is very much operative in my thinking, insofar as I think of the global South as part of an interrogation of the frame of law and literature and law and humanities more broadly. And I think as law and literature and law and humanities expand, there is a need to rethink some of its key coordinates, like, what does the term law mean in different contexts? What does the term literature mean in different contexts? In the case of law and literature, what are the literary texts that constitute the law and literature canon? And a discussion of the term the Global South that I found helpful in my own thinking is in the recent volume on the Global South and Comparative Constitutional Law. I think it came out with the review in 2020. And this is a volume that's been edited by 3 German constitutional theorists. And in that volume, they argue that we can think of the Global South not so much, or not only as a place, and this is something that we've been talking about so far, not only as a place, but also as a sensibility and a lived experience. A sensibility in the sense of the Global South as a concept that troubles the existing framework of comparative constitutional law, which is, again, the discipline that they were talking about. Right? An idea that throws into question the assumptions and the narratives of comparative constitutional law. And a lived experience, and I think this echoes with what Diana was saying about shared experiences, a lived experience as in the experience of people who are living within particular constitutional regimes outside the liberal democracies of the global north. So in the context of law and literature, I think of the Global South as part of this larger project of troubling law and literature as it has been traditionally defined and demarcated. So one question that I've been thinking through in my own work is, well, when we shift our gaze from areas like North America, Britain, continental Europe, how are terms like literature and law defined? And perhaps more importantly, what are the kinds of relationships between the legal and the literary that we find? What kinds of literary texts, film texts are produced, and how do they engage with the experience of living within those legal constitutional regimes? So, I don't write on Global South as a kind of geographical entity, but the concept is very much on my mind in my work.
Thank you, Marco. Let me revisit some of my notes here, because I want to draw commonalities and also point at some differences. Let me start with Marco, and I'll make my way over to Diana's remarks. This alignment or misalignment between the global north and liberal democracies, I think, would be really worth interrogating, right? When we talk about law and humanities, law and literature, is global north, always the same as liberal democracy? How would that affect our thinking? Is that the norm? Everything else is the exception. Everything else is less than, in certain account, including indigenous jurisdictions, for instance, right? And how do we encounter that? So I'm just throwing, tossing the salad here. Now, I also think it's great how in Beth's account of how indigeneity disrupts North and South thinking. This is so clear in, say, 19th century Latin American literature. I mentioned that because I'm familiar with that corpus, that indigeneity exists, quote unquote, in literature and in novel before it ever goes into anything resembling, legal thought, right? So you'll have whiter criollo authors in that context who imagine indigeneity, and this has later on consequences in actual juridical frameworks and practices. So I'd love to hear, how does that, back and forth about the representation of indigeneity and the affordances of indigenous law work. Just again, throwing questions out there. Similarly, when Leila gives us the example of thugs, right? Thuggery, the thuggies, and how this, racialized criminal ends up becoming a trope and what Roman Jacobson would call a dead metaphor, right? So people in the English language are using casually the term thug, sometimes in connection to football, for instance, right? That this is where it emerges sometimes. And the tribal practices of sports fans is how you might sometimes hear the word thug. It's interesting how literature or cultural production, again, revisits the legal category and establishes a kind of influential conversation that is somehow in the background. And it's only when one makes it explicit, right, that you approach it. And similarly, when Diana was talking about nonlinear development, contingency, positionality, sites in the Global South as sites of knowledge production, one thing that stood out for me is the use of the metaphor of horizontality and verticality, because these are metaphors, these are only words. I mean, I can only see things as a literary critic, much as I try to learn, thanks to Marco and Jorge González Jacome and others, to think a little bit like a lawyer. But when I hear you say, the horizontal or the vertical, matter of factly, and as a method, the post-structuralist in me wants to say, but isn't that just a metaphor? So I don't know, just throwing and regurgitating some ideas back at anyone who'd like to maybe respond.
Maybe I could sort of start things off, given that you asked me the first question, Hector. And it's such an important question. I mean, is the global north synonymous with liberal democracies, right? And the answer is, well, of course not. But I do think that sometimes in discussions of constitutional law, especially, there is this tendency to conflate the two, right? So we compare, I don't know, the US, France, Germany, and we're looking at constitutional structures and rights and judicial review, and sometimes there can be a kind of illusion of the idea that, well, these two things are not necessarily the same. And I think part of the importance of the work that we're doing in a forum like this one is to foreground, right, the idea that the two are not synonymous. And I do think that also literature has the role to play here, right, insofar as they provide narratives with that foreground, like communities and experiences that are kind of outside the scope of legal analysis or comparative legal analysis a lot of the time.
Let me perhaps segue into another moment of our conversation as we gather more elements here. On the topic of the global north and liberal democracy being synonymous or not, a few days ago, we're living, when people see this recording 10 years from now, they might not know the context, but Russia just invaded the Ukraine. And the West, the liberal West, was invigorated. As we speak, this entity, the liberal West, is invigorated. Europe has opened its doors to Ukrainian immigrants in a way that did not happen when Syria was producing refugees. So I don't want to editorialize or opine here, but there is something about the construction of the other that has a huge influence in what is regarded as more or less legitimate beyond anyone's understanding of Article 5 of NATO or beyond the formal legal categories. It's just the reaction and the space of maneuvering is strikingly shaped, I think, by some of these cultural types and stereotypes. We had asked you to give some thought about how your research engages issues of law and literature or law and humanities more broadly. How do you relate those two domains? The affordances, limitations of coupling law and humanities. We could be having a conference about law and economics, and maybe we would have 600 of our closest friends with us. But we have decided to bring law and literature or law and humanities together. Is that the coupling that we want to have, or should we have others? Should we have other conversations? Does law and literature work differently in the global South? We're thinking about your respective research agendas, any examples you'd like to share, One thing that's on the table is Weber's notion of disenchantment, the differentials across locales, right? That project of radical secularization as the linear progression of modernity, to revisit the term that Diana used earlier. Are there specific legal problems and cultural correlates that you'd like to direct our attention to? So the floor is open for our panelists, and this time, why don't we hear from Beth first, Leila second, Marco third, and Diana last. Let's see if that makes sense. Beth.
Well, thank you for calling on me, because actually there's a little bit of a sort of transition from this idea of the liberal democracy. So a question that's always motivated my work is, what kinds of rights attach to what kinds of bodies? Like, this is just basically the question I'm always bringing forward. And one of the greatest ongoing tensions we see in liberal democracies is the problem of individual versus collective rights. And so Indian treaties are held as collectives. So the body is a political polity, it's a mass, it's not the individual that holds the right. And, you know, Indians, to use the term at the time, are named in the Constitution as Indians not taxed. And the confounding nature of this inclusion is that it's not clear whether this reference is to individual bodies or to indigenous polities or to both. What is the body that, you know, is taxable? What is the body that is possible to hold rights or not? So the collective nature of treaty rights has been under constant assault since the 19th century and within these liberal democracies. And indigenous polities have struggled to balance operating both within an individual and a collective system. And at times, the sort of imposition of constitutions and different legal systems has, you know, displaced traditional forms of governance, such as matriarchies or other forms of law that are enacted in the everyday. So to the question of law and literature, you know, all texts are partial. So working across law and literature gives us an opportunity to see two partial texts put together that we hope can show us a fuller picture. So an example from a reading that I did of the Indian Act in Canada from the 19th century with Mohawk writer E. Pauline Johnson's short story that shows how a white man's life is devastated when his Mohawk wife leaves him because of the Indian Act. Through this reading of this love relationship coming undone, I argue that literature shows us how even the unnamed subjects of law can become its direct victims. So if we only read the law, then we think that only the lives of Indigenous people are being regulated by the Indian Act. Only Indigenous people are named in this act. But the story shows us that even the most secure subject, the white man, can be undone by it. They are also being regulated by it. So if we only read the law, we think that only the law of Indigenous people are being regulated. If we only read the story, we think it's about a failed romance. But what the story is really about is the ways that law saturates even the most intimate spaces of our lives and has the power to destroy even the most privileged subjects of the nation, the most privileged by being unnamed white men. So literature can name and show how these dynamics actually play out in the intimate space of even love. So law is essential for understanding the political nature and the critique of power that, you know, Indigenous writers are offering, showing how the law plays out in everyday life and saying it's not just about, you know, this story isn't just about love. But then love also isn't just about love. So another example is Luther Standing Bear's memoir that he wrote describing his experiences in 1879 of being taken to Carlisle Indian boarding school. And the schools were expressly in policy designed, no one hid the intentions of the schools. The stated intentions were to break students' attachment to their families, their languages, their cultural practices, and their tribal homelands. So through the memoir, what we see Standing Bear doing is repeatedly writing with great admiration for his father and for his culture. So again, if we read these texts in isolation, we don't see how deeply political Standing Bear's work is. Because if you only read the memoir, then it's just a story about a boy who loves his father. But if we see how the law was designed to break him, then the memoir becomes an indictment of a system that was designed to break this very bond. He loved his father. The policy failed. And so these are very deep politics. And so law in humanities is an important approach because it illuminates the context in which these cultural texts are being produced, and it shows us the power of the ordinary.
Wonderful. I have so many notes. Leila.
Thank you for that, Beth. I think actually I have so many thoughts as well. And I think that my next question, the one after this, is actually really interestingly related to yours as well. So hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to conversation. But when I was answering this question, I approached it more from the perspective of how does law and literature sort of intersect with one another, and how do they sort of how do they relate to one another as concepts? And so, obviously this is a practical question on some level, even in terms of how to structure a book, right? Do you have a chapter on one at a time? Do you try to weave them together somehow? How do you sort of practically approach it? And in my book, I focus on a series of appeals to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which was the highest court of appeals for the colonies at large. And I pair those appeals with a selection of Victorian novels from the same period. And so more broadly, I look at how legal formations, whether specific legal cases or actual laws, interface with literature. I've also sought to reframe some of the ways in which law and literature have typically been theorized together. The relationship between law and literature has tended to be thought of as either oppositional or identical. Often the terms of the relationship are either law and or literature, or law as literature. And I really wanted to find a way out of those sort of parameters. So in my approach, which draws on a kind of spatial metaphor of adjacency that has been particularly central to the project of queer theory. And for example, Eve Sedgwick speaks of the beside as a productive framework for analysis that allows us to conceptualize the multiple and messy relationships that can arise out of two things being placed next to each other. This methodology moves away from both the binary as well as developmental or teleological ways of thinking about how law and literature interface with one another. Likewise, Jose Esteban Munoz offers us the idea of the beside as well as an alternative to being either beyond, against, or identical to something else. And in this regard, we're not limited to comparing the law and literature as two intact or self-contained systems, but instead we can think about how they sit next to each other, often with fuzzy boundaries within a shared ideological field that works sometimes differently and sometimes similarly to produce both. So for many law and literature scholars, one way out of the binary or developmental models has been through thinking of the law and literature as analogs, often with the reading public serving a similar function to a jury within a trial. I believe this analogy breaks down in the Global South, though. where the reading public cannot be so easily compared to a jury of peers. Within the more hierarchical models of colonial legal structures, the fiction of a jury of peers was unsustainable when in fact trials were being decided by English juries in India and appeals were heard by English privy councillors in London. On the literary side, we can take the example of the mystery novel, which theorists like D.A. Miller, Tsvetan Todorov, and Franco Moretti have described as having the function of isolating guilt in the figure of the criminal, while simultaneously exculpating the reading public and society at large. I would argue that in the colonial context, by contrast, the invocation in both the literary and legal spheres is to identify with the criminal as the disciplinary subject. So in this respect, the locational context determines how one reads and identifies with certain plots and narrative turns, both legal and literary.
Thank you very much, Leila. Marco, I believe.
Just one more point about this juncture, I guess, between the global north and liberal democracies. I mean, again, the two are not synonymous, but what I do find really interesting, I mean, sitting here in Hong Kong, is the power of the narratives that insist that the two are synonymous. Right? So, I mean, Hong Kong, we're given this narrative that, Britain gave us the rule of law, right? Rights. Britain started democratic reform in Hong Kong, even though for much of the colonial period, right, rights weren't respected. Right, there really wasn't. The rule of law wasn't really taken that seriously. Right? But that narrative continues, and it still plays a very important role in society in Hong Kong today. I mean, 20 years after the handover, 25 years after the handover. But I mean, to come back to your question about how I try to relate the two domains of law and humanities, law and literature. So, I mean, my thinking has changed over the years, I think. So I started by writing about law and fiction, as Hector mentioned, and I tried to argue in the Literature Trials book that law and literature are intertwined discourses. Right? So they're both products of language, and as such, they are engaging with similar questions of representation. Right, so when I was looking at these literary trials in the 19th century, I assumed when I began that we would find literature and law very much on opposite sides. So law as this kind of active agent of regulation, literature as this passive object that was being regulated. But in fact, what I thought was fascinating was that if you looked at the trial transcripts and the judgments, and you juxtapose them with the literary texts, what you find is that they actually are caught up in each other's rhetorical structures, narrative structures, and modes of meaning creation. Yeah. And then for the law and film book, I started working with visual material, working with images. And what really struck me was just how different the logic of the visual is from the logic of law. So I started by looking at legal material and synonymous material from particular moments of constitutional controversy in Hong Kong. And these were controversies that mattered hugely to people, right? So there were these court cases that kind of everybody knew, at least by name and by facts. And if you look at the legal material itself, right, if you look at the court cases, if you look at the constitutional provisions, if you look at the statutory instruments, I think it's actually very difficult to get a sense of why these controversies mattered so much. But if you look at the films from the same constitutional moments, curiously, it becomes clearer, right, why these controversies mattered or resonated, which is that, I try to argue that the constitutional dispute spoke directly to questions about cultural identity in the city. And so how do I try to relate the two domains in my work here, law and film? I think of film as a kind of supplement to law. not in the sense of a moral supplement or an ethical supplement, but in the sense that film can show us something about constitutional law that the language of constitutional law cannot quite articulate. So to give you one example, so one film that I'm very interested in is film 2046 by the Hong Kong director Wong Kar-wai. Right? And this is the film that seemingly has nothing to do with law. But I take 2046 to be a kind of the title 2046 to be a kind of oblique reference to the year 2047, which is the year that the constitutional guarantees in the basic law in Hong Kong could lapse. Right? And there is this phrase, remain unchanged for 50 years, which is enshrined in the basic law. And that kind of resonates in Hong Kong society, right? That the economic system in Hong Kong would remain unchanged for 50 years. That's encapsulated in the basic law, which, if you think about it, is quite curious, right? What does it mean to try to keep a place unchanged for 50 years? And what does it mean to kind of raise that to the level of a constitutional guarantee? And I think the sensibility of a place remaining unchanged is often not explored in the legal discourse, but a film becomes a forum for exploring that idea. Right? So the film is in many ways a love story, right? And by asking the question of what it might mean for love to remain unchanged. Right, the film, however obliquely, is engaging with this question of, well, what does it mean for a place to remain unchanged, for an idea to remain unchanged, for a state of affairs to remain unchanged. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Marco. Diana.
Thank you. So I'm going to approach this question from a completely different point of view, probably because I am more lawyer than a literature scholar. So what I'm going to say is, back in the day when I used to teach legal theory, I used to approach this relationship between law and literature from the perspective of the distinction that the American academics have created. This is the difference between law as literature, law of the literature, law in literature, and law by literature. So this is basically the difference between thinking law from the perspective of the methodologies of literature, or from the perspective of the way of thinking literature. And in this case, authors such as Dworkin were very important and very interesting to understand law as literature, especially when he was trying to explain what law is in practice by using a metaphor, the metaphor of the novel in chain, which is basically the idea that law is created by different authors that are creating different chains of a long chain of events and decisions. And I think this is a very interesting idea, but with time, what I've been more interested in is in this other part, which is law in literature, which is basically the question about how literature approach law and other fundamental issues such as justice and power. And that's the part that I've been more interested in for the past few years. And so I think, and I approach this from the perspective of, with the idea that literature actually sheds light on law's moral stance. So it can actually gives you evidence of how law can be unjust, and how these unequal power relations are placed, have an important place in societies, and what law does or not towards those inequalities. And so in that sense, what I was reflecting on for this conversation was about whether the global south, whether it works differently in the global south or not. And what I was thinking within this idea of the relationship or law in literature more concretely is that I do think that law in the global south tend to be different from law in the global north. In what sense? This can be very controversial, and there are, of course, different ways to approach this. But I do think, and my argument here is, context matter to law development. It's not the same to have a context in which you have cultural and ethnic diversity with a lot of indigenous populations, Afro-descendant communities and campesino communities in a multicultural space with a multilingual approach that creates hybrid culture and hybrid institutions with poverty, inequality, discrimination, lack of effective enjoyment of rights, democratic breakdowns, conflict and authoritarianism, and institutional weaknesses, because in those contexts, law is different. Instead of describing and formalizing the guarantees that populations already have that they effectively enjoy, this is, instead of coding and institutionalizing reality, law in the global south is actually bringing promises of social change and rights, and a lot of ideas of social transformation that social movements try to make reality. And so it creates a lot of legal phenomena that are more present in the global south than in the global north, such as this idea of transformative and aspirational constitutionalism, which is very important and very prominent, for example, in the Latin American constitutionalism. We cannot understand the constitutional phenomenon in Latin America without understanding that a lot of the constitutional provisions in our constitutions are actually aspirations rather than actual rights that people effectively enjoy in their daily lives. And therefore the idea of law as a powerful tool for social transformation is also part of this whole idea of fighting against injustice and inequality. And so judicial activism is also more present in this type of context in which constitutions are aspirations that a social mobilization trying to bring to reality. And of course, all of these hand in hand with the legal pluralism and this fight for decolonizing law. So as a consequence, it brings to law and literature analysis concerns about injustices. It puts at the center of the stage how these injustices play in literature and how it reflects some of the limits of the way in which law development evolves. So some of the concerns that are present in the literature that analyzes literature and the relationship with laws is precisely things about colonialism and its consequences, the land issue. There's like a lot of studies about those many novels that actually engage with the land issue in different parts of Latin America, in Mexico, in Colombia, Siervos sin Tierra, Pedro Páramo. Some of the great novels of the Latin American literature actually engage with this issue, racism, other forms of discrimination, gender-based violence, which is very present also in Latin American literature and has been a very important site for academic production in law. And there are other issues such as state formation and authoritarianism. It is a fact that state formation is one of the main issues in the global south. How do we understand what it means to create a state, because we haven't followed the same path as the liberal tradition of the global North. War on reconciliation, that's a very important element in these developments. And of course, and very important and very present in my own research, the transformative potential of personal narratives of subaltern subjects as a way to produce also transformations, not only in the legal field, but also in the social field.
Thank you, Diana. As before, let me share some of my notes. One thing that stood out in Beth's response is that knowing the law or understanding the legal issues at stake would make someone a better literary critic. And you know, because that was a common thread. Like, how would you organize the study of law and humanities? How would you even write a book? And sometimes there is that false dichotomy, the opposition that you have to do close reading and not engage with the law. But in fact, I think, Beth, what you just showed us in that very generous and succinct discussion of sources that you have worked with is that indeed knowing the law makes you a better literary reader. I don't know that every literary reader has to go there, but for some objects of study, this is already perhaps segueing into our next question, it really makes sense. I also appreciated in Leila's response, we moved from the horizontal vertical axis, also metaphorical, to a different tropology and toponymy. Leila walked us from the oppositional to the identical to this image of adjacency. And on the point of the identification with the criminal in the global South, I cannot help but noting that in one of the quintessential Spanish or Hispanic genres, the picaresque, it's all about identifying with the picaro, because readers are closer to lowlifes, right, than they are to magistrates. So of course you will identify with the picaro, right? So really fascinating, Leila, to hear you say that. Then Marco gave us two visions that are equally useful: the intertwined law and humanities, and the supplemental cinema in this case, and the law, the supplementarity. I would love to investigate more in that supplementarity, the nature of that supplement that can never be quite assimilated, right? That's a whole discussion in psychoanalysis as well. For now or for another moment. Of course, I'm just sharing my notes and my enthusiasm. And then Diana, more recently, told us about the law's moral stance in literature and how through personal narratives, for instance, that you have studied, there are real tangible ways of intervention. I would love to ask you at some point, Diana, about the risks of aspirational constitutionalism. In the case of Bolivia, for instance, you have, I don't remember how many constitutions, how many, over a very short period of time. And there's that moment, I mean, Marco was saying, what does it mean to have, the law fixated in time as if nothing could change? And I appreciate the question. What does it mean to have the Constitution be rewritten every 3 or 4 years? Is that even tenable? So these are some reactions, neither here nor there. In real life, in person, in a room, it would be very easy for someone to take this in a direction or another. Zoom is more regimented. That's why we have these questions for our round table. But if anyone wants to pick up any of these threads, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we have other questions in store as well.
So I'm just going to add something about that last question that you posed, because I think that's actually fascinating, at least for a lawyer. I don't know for everyone else, but yes, indeed. I mean, when I talk about aspirational constitutionalism, I'm describing the types of constitutions that you find in Latin America. Not only Latin America, but this is the type of constitutions I've been studying for the past 8 years. And so what I think is very interesting is to show how what they are, what this type of constitutions convey is basically a promise of a better society in which everyone should be included and there would be like a better relationship. But the downside of this is that sometimes these aspirations are not possible to achieve. And in the process, societies tend to feel left behind or completely out of a very concrete social project, and therefore there are continuous constitutional changes. That's not the case for every constitution that is aspirational. For example, in Colombia, we have a very aspirational constitution as well. Since 1991, it's been 30 years, and even though it has gone through a lot of reforms, it's still in place, and it's a solid one. Let's say, at least I mean, it's the same constitution, and it's been in place for 30 years. So it hasn't had the same level of changes that other constitutions in Latin America. What it's interesting about this one is that we have a constitutional court that is trying to make a reality, make these promises a reality. And that's different from what has been happening in other countries. But of course, this brings us to a lot of conversations about what it means for democracy and what it means for the democratic debate in these countries, which I don't think it's the topic of this conversation.
But there seems to be a leap of faith in the law, no? That's interesting, you know, for such a secular discourse, and I'm showing my colors here by calling the law discourse. I know that would be contentious among several folks, but for all its secularity, there's that dimension of the aspirational. I mean, even in I don't know, the hermeneutic tradition of the U.S. Constitution, how it's read, you know, how that foundational "we the people" is read. What I'd like to do now is to bring us to our last question, and for folks in the audience, we pre-circulated 4 questions to have these short answers from everyone. I'm going to read out loud the last 2 questions and ask our panelists to maybe walk us through some of your answers together of these last questions, because I think that would be that would amount for a better flow. So the question was, what is the object of analysis of law and literature in the Global South? What is the object of analysis? Should it be formal law and novels? And this is done, you know, plenty in the Global North and in the liberal juridical tradition. Should it be legal cultures and music in contexts where music is perhaps more important than a novel in the Dickensian sense of the word? Exception and propaganda, orality and territoriality, etc. What would be the object of analysis? And then the other question that perhaps we can try and bridge would be, how do you encounter the opposition between legal universalism and particularism in your contexts? And what role does cultural production have in brokering between these 2 poles? I'm thinking here of Jorge Luis Borges, who was a notorious anti-populist thinker and writer. And so he has this tale called The Congress, El Congreso, where he walks you through a series of absurd syllogistic inferences until you arrive to the conclusion that every man, right, quote unquote, should have its own or his own law, right? So law is absurd because we're all like these atoms in the vision that Borges, who was an anti-populist, anti-collectivist, great writer, would envisage. So universalism and particularism are obviously in conflict in many contexts, and I wonder if cultural production has a role. I'm going to do something uncommon. I'm going to stand up and turn on the lights, because otherwise I'm going to disappear in the darkness of my Zoom screen, and ask any of you who'd like to take a first stab at these questions to please go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in. My early work focused on how Indigenous writers responded to settler colonial law. But more recently, I've turned to the study of Indigenous law in cultural texts. And so the kinds of materials I'm interested in are songs, the presence of Indigenous languages and aesthetics, performances, textiles, both within and beyond literary texts. So textiles on their own, but also the representation of textiles within a text. And all of these materials are forms and expressions that are ephemeral or coded. And this has shifted my methodological approach to draw on sensory studies, to think especially about sound studies and visual analysis. So Indigenous law has this really long time frame. And once colonization sets in, a lot of these legal practices have to be maintained underground, or legal concepts get maintained underground. And that's why they move into these other cultural forms. So a song has no material existence except for vibration. And so it has great power to evade surveillance or physical destruction by sort of larger legal forces. But the vibration itself is very powerful. It travels across boundaries. It has a way of claiming territory and asserting Indigenous autonomy. So the vibration of sound, it has this great mapping power, sort of creates this jurisonics. So I've been thinking a lot about what songs, both singing and drumming, are doing in texts to assert Indigenous legal orders. But it also allows me to think about sound and to think about sonic warfare, such as the use of drones or sonic bombs in protests at Standing Rock, or the criminalization of Indigenous song and dance in the 19th and 20th century. So I'm also interested in studying the competing temporal orders in law conflicts between Indigenous people in the state. And this is something that I think does create coherence around the concept of indigeneity as a category. Indigenous concepts of time. So we see time organized differently in Indigenous languages. And there's just a lot of fluidity about moving across temporal zones. And this is just kind of too big to talk about, but I'm just like marking it. So I just wanted to add that in addition to my scholarship, I'm also an Indigenous language activist and a creative writer. And so these ideas about sound and language and law and time, they all infuse these different modes of my work. And just to pick up on this question about the universal or the particular, is that I think the most obvious tension again is around the discourse of universal human rights as individual rights. And again, this is a question about what kind of bodies bear what kind of rights. Is the human the only body? Is the individual right the only right? And I'm not against the discourse of human rights or the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, because they're enormously important and obviously more robust than I've just suggested in this quick sketch. But I'm simply saying that if everything has to be channeled through the language of individual rights, then certain Indigenous epistemologies and practices and legal concepts will be elided. So the example I'd point to very quickly is in 2017, the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, was granted legal personhood. And other nations, including Indigenous nations in North America, have followed this practice. So this act is both the success and the failure of the framework of individual rights. Now, human rights and personhood rights are not the same. So I want to avoid that conflation. The river is having rights as a legal entity. It's been recognized as a type of body that can carry rights. And Maori people have supported this act. But beyond the specificity of that case, for some Indigenous people, legal personhood for a river isn't necessarily the right that people hold most dear. A right is a thing. And sometimes Indigenous people are asserting their right to something more dynamic, the right to a relationship with another being, such as a river. They want the relationship to be recognized, which is what we find sort of embedded in treaty rights, the protection of a relationship. So again, the Wanganui case is a powerful event and very positive. I'm just trying to flesh out the limitations of the individual rights as universal. So, stop there.
Thank you, Beth. Leila, I think you just muted yourself. Okay.
Sorry, there. Yeah, I can jump in if nobody else wants to go next. But yeah, so I actually was hoping to come back a little bit to Beth's earlier comment about reading literature as kind of a supplement to reading the law, and reading law as kind of a supplement to reading literature, and the way in which they both sort of traffic alongside one another. And I was thinking in particular, for me, my objective analysis is kind of formal law and novels. And I'm thinking in particular about how reading them together reveals certain things about each that we wouldn't necessarily notice if we read them separately. And one example of that is Wilkie Collins' mystery novel, The Moonstone. And it's a situation that I was mapping out earlier in terms of, you know, the focus of the novel being on deciphering a kind of individual guilt, right? And the reading public is simultaneously rendered innocent by virtue of figuring out who the guilty person is, right? And the guilty person is notably individual, right? And that works, that plot, right, works in a kind of opposite direction from the legal plot of a 1846 case, Adelgy, the Queen v. Adelgy Byramji, in which 18 Indian men were tried for a single murder. And the question before the Privy Council was whether criminal appeals could be heard by the Privy Council. And ultimately what they decided was that, in fact, criminal appeals could not be heard. And the reason for this was that there would be the delay that was caused by the appeals process, in the sense that, you know, you'd have to write letters back and forth between Bombay and London at the time, right? That would cause a kind of undue burden on the criminal who is awaiting execution, right? And so the idea was that there would be a sort of injustice in asking the criminal to wait to be executed over a period of the years that it took for the appeal to unfold. So, you know, the legal and literary plots kind of move in opposite directions in terms of, you know, both the sort of number of criminals in the Indian case and the kind of singularity of criminality in the English case, and the way in which, as I was saying earlier, there's a sort of invocation to identify with the criminal and to sort of, you know, socialize the criminal to represent a kind of broader swath of Indian subjectivity at large. And I found that, as Marco was mentioning earlier, that often there's this sort of sense in which literary plots kind of uphold legal plots as well. And it's not always the case. There are sometimes instances in which, you know, the law is sometimes more capacious in imagining subjectivities and you know, in some instances, even the Indian appeals process is more capacious in imagining potential possibilities than the English novel is. But by and large, we have this sort of, you know, tension between a kind of broadness of English imagination and a kind of narrowing of imaginative possibilities for the colonial subject. And this is maybe related to the question of universalism and particularism as well. And I think this is probably also related to the question of the global South with which we began, in the sense that I think that to the extent that concept has some problems, it's probably in the sense that it involves almost a romanticism or a cosmopolitanist kind of fantasy, the kind of horizontal community that Diana was gesturing towards. And, you know, of course, folks like Makau Mutua has commented on the problems of cosmopolitanism and universal human rights. And I think that within the Indian context, that tension between the universal and the particular has always been central. And I'm thinking in particular of the ways in which that sort of problematic of the universal and the particular has always been a joint problem of the legal and the literary. So, for example, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who is the author of the Indian Penal Code, which becomes a model for penal codes across the British colonial world. He's also the author of the Minute on Indian Education, which instituted English as the language of colonial education. And so, there's this sort of twin impulses of literary and legal plots, and they both sort of fall apart around this question of their own universal aspirations coming into contact with their particular implementations. So, for example, if the penal code was envisioned as a kind of universal code that would be rational and just, in practice, it was actually, Macaulay advocated for very different punishments for European criminals in India versus Indian criminals. And so, for example, he advocated suspending sentences for European criminals or sending them to more temperate climates for transportation. And, in contrast to capital punishment and transportation often to Southeast Asia for Indian criminals. And so the universalist aspirations were sort of, called into question by the very particularist forms of enforcement. And I think that same trajectory kind of holds in the literary context as well. And I'm thinking here of actually the ways in which that tendency lingers into the post-colonial moment as well. And in particular, we can think of the example of Arundhati Roy's novel, The God of Small Things, which I actually wrote about in Marco's journal. So what we see is that in a novel that otherwise is very progressive in terms of imagining, love relationships across caste, for example, where it really falls apart is around the question of queer desire. And in fact, it repeats many of the same problems of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which has historically worked to conflate homosexuality and child sexual abuse. And so the ways in which these, the particularities of legal enforcement continue to inflect post-colonial imaginations and lives, I think is really significant. And sort of very briefly, in terms of thinking about interventions into this, part of the goal, I think, of the colonial endeavor was to create a universal language, right, in the law and in literature that would make possible a shared ideological framework. And one of the ways in which I think, some of the early nationalist figures intervened in this was through vernacular literatures and vernacular drama. And it's not to say that the vernacular literature is somehow immune to the logic of colonialism, but that it did offer a less readily policed form of both sociality and literariness. And so I'm thinking in particular of some of the early mid-19th century plays, Bengali plays. For example, there is one called The Police of Pig and Sheep, which satirized the kind of comically named Superintendent Lamb and Police Commissioner Hogg. And so, there are other instances in which the Prince of Wales was satirized, and it actually resulted in the passage of the Dramatic Performances Act of 1876, which banned political plays. And so again, we see this kind of tension between the aspirations of a universal kind of, law that is just and rational, coming into conflict with the particular sort of enforcements and origins of those laws.
Thank you, Leila. I'll ask Marco and Diana, in any order you'd like to speak, to maybe be succinct, because I worry that it's probably, there's going to be meetings for Marco because it's tomorrow in Hong Kong and he might have to dash out of the Zoom meeting at some point.
Okay, well, maybe I'll jump in. So what is the object of analysis for me? I think for me, the object of analysis is is the relationship between literature and law, rather than the kind of literary objects or the legal objects per se. And I think, and this kind of goes to the question about universalism versus particularity as well. And I try to kind of resist the urge to move towards a kind of universal theory of how literature and law can be theorized, because I think the relationship between those two things can be different depending on the objects that we're talking about, depending on the locality that we're talking about, depending on the specific historical moment that we're talking about. So I think in some instances, it doesn't really make sense to keep the boundaries between those two things, right? That they're both in some moments it makes sense to think about the two of them as both as kind of discursive domains, and there, I think that the idea of intertwining is a helpful one. But I think in other instances, it makes absolute sense to keep those boundaries intact, right? And to think of both law and literature as distinct entities. And so it depends on where we're looking at, what moment we're looking at, and what the objects we're looking at any particular point in time. So I'll stop there.
Well, I'm just going to add a very concrete idea about the object of analysis of law and literature in the Global South, which is the idea that as opposed to the relationship between formal law and novels in the Global South, I think there's a broader perspective about what law means and what a legal phenomenon is. So in the literature, there's a significant presence of concerns about criminality and criminal orders, precisely because there's a recognition that the formal law is not enough and has a lot of limitations. And another important concern in this relationship is the one about compliance of law. So there are many documents and there's a very interesting literature about the analysis of music and the relationship with law, right? So the narco corridos and the analysis of how narco corridos reflect a very interesting relationship of people with criminal orders, but also with state law. And I think those relationships are very interesting in the literature and in different cultural products in Latin America and other Global South countries, which also constitute an interesting contribution to this analysis of the relationship between law and literature. In terms of the divide between universalism and particularism, I'm just gonna say that indeed, as Leila was saying, universalism in law is an aspiration. It comes from the liberal tradition, but as we know, the liberal tradition is not as universal as it was supposed to be, because as we remember, the first countries that allowed the vote were decided to do so in a sensitive way. So only some people, particularly white men with property, had the right to vote. So that universalism has always been an aspiration in law, but it doesn't really convey the whole picture about what law is and means and actually represents in people's lives. And so that idea, that aspiration has been called into question a long time ago, not only because it can represent an imposition of a very Western way to understand law and guarantees and rights, but also because in the application, as Leila said as well, there are a lot of biases and selectivity, not only in the Global South, but also in the Global North. And so the law enforcement is not as universal as it was supposed to be. But additionally, because the idea and the aspiration of universalism is insufficient. It's insufficient for the people who is.
Did we lose Diana?
In transitional, sorry.
for a moment. We lost you for a moment, but you're back. You were saying how it is
I
insufficient.
think my internet is unstable. I don't know what to do.
Oh,
Do
yes.
you hear me?
Yes, we can, but your image froze. Interesting.
I am so.
Diana, may I suggest, why don't you turn off your camera for a moment and maybe wrap up your thought? That way we might be able to listen. Just a bandwidth issue. Diana, we still can't hear you. I am going to go ahead and mention a couple of points that I have underlined in the hopes that Diana will return.
Sorry.
Oh, you're back. Yes.
My connection is quite unstable. I tried, but I don't know what happened. So I don't know when I missed the connection. So I don't know what I was talking about when.
If you have any final thoughts.
Okay, yeah. So just to your point about whether cultural production can have some role in broadening these two poles, I do think that there's a very interesting role that art can play in broadening these two poles. Basically, and the example I want to bring here is the one about transitional justice and the ways in which reparations are changing and are including art as part of the processes with communities and victims, because that's a way to actually understand individual experiences and at the same time trying to create the conditions for reparation, which is one of the universalist aspirations that these rights of victims bring to people.
Thank you so much, Diana. Okay, I'm going to pick up some threads and maybe in short order adjourn this formal portion so that we can stop recording soon-ish and take in other questions from attendees, promote them to participants. If you'd like to quickly say hi before we close up for the day. Thank you, Beth, for this term of jurisonics and the work more broadly that you've been doing to extend the purview of literature, sometimes overly narrowly conceived. Leila, I wanted to share, I don't know if you've heard, but part of the push in the constitutional reform in Chile has to do with how if someone breaks the law as a Mapuche, they are tried for terrorism. If you don't happen to be Mapuche, then you're not tried for terrorism. This is some legacy of Pinochet regime. So these questions are very much alive. Marco, it's such a salutary thing to hear about law and literature as something fluid and that it's part of an interplay. Because the mind, especially I think when dealing with the law, right, sometimes just goes eagerly towards the stable, the universal, and as you point out, things change and you cannot generalize. And also coming from you and your vantage point as the editor of a journal called Law and Literature, that's really powerful. And then Diana, thank you also for bringing to bear the specific example. I really appreciated that. What we have put together today is something of a toolbox, and I hope that folks might avail themselves to this recording and listen in, because there are really there's so much expertise that just was mobilized in this conversation. Ways of solving the riddle about how to do law and humanities are really there. As you all know, tomorrow we're going to continue this conversation with the topic of the rights of nature and the imagination. So juridical personhood of rivers was mentioned. It's going to be front and center tomorrow. With that, Joe, if you wouldn't mind maybe joining us for a moment. I'm going to thank everyone again, and Joe, whenever you're ready to hit the stop recording button, we'll transition.